Hey class, I decided to do my project to end this semester and can't wait to graduate on West Fraser Timber. It's a publicly traded company founded back in 1955 by three brothers up in Quinaul, BC, British Columbia. Yes, it's a Canadian company, surprise, but quick background on why I kind of felt like I wanted to go with something. A, it was different. We haven't really dealt with anything like this before. B, I was ziplining up there back home, really in Manitoba, a couple years ago, standing on top of these platforms on top of 100-foot, wooden poles, and I just kind of asked, where did these come from? And the tour guide told me that they were actually Georgia pines that were brought up by West Fraser. So it really spiked my interest because you've got a company based out of British Columbia bringing product in from Georgia, and I asked him, and he said, they were the cheapest on the bid. So then that really kind of surprised me and wanted me to do a little bit of digging and see, how did they do this? This a couple years later, I was able to kind of really dig in and find out. A big answer to that is anytime that you hear cheapest, a lot of times you've got leanest in supply chain, and it's really no different here. They operate an extremely efficient, extremely compressed in terms of lead time and ETA on throughout their product flow cycle. The average life cycle for their lumber and stuff may only be a couple weeks, whereas others can be months. They really try to move product in and out of the lumber yard, whether it be fresh cut logs in to go to debarking or finished product waiting to ship out. They operate about 40 mills, almost split evenly out of British Columbia and Alberta, and then the southern United States. The southern United States is strictly southern yellow pine, doing 2x4s, 2x6s, your typical kind of building material that you'd think of, really that supports a lot of the U.S. housing market, along with some of the spruce pine fir that they are pulling out of Canada too. Don't get me wrong, they export more into the U.S. of that than they do into Canada itself. One thing to note there is a big kind of if threat during the analysis is what is this new um, government gonna do with the softwood lumber deal? The trade deal that they had going for about the last 10-15 years has expired, and it's really up in the air because that was pretty friendly. Experts think that there's going to be higher export duties laid on Canadian lumber now coming into the US, which isn't ideal because that's where the market is in terms of building. So one way that I was looking at they could try to mitigate that a little bit would be to start looking at acquiring mills just south of the border in Washington, even Oregon, and look if they could do any of their finished products there. Even if they could move some of the pulp or paneling there. Also, if they could even, if they can source out of there, which they can to a degree, they've got some competition there, whereas in Western Canada they don't have as much competition. But if they can source out of there, that'd be strong. They've, from research, look like they would be paying less duties if they could even just bring timber in and then actually do the finished product there in the U.S. So even if you could convert a couple mills to do that, that may cut out some of that export duty that's kind of in the future. We see like another thing, a lot of the global market is starting to catch up. Not so much to say in pure lumber, but in other small secondary markets like the pulp, the paper, and the panel. There's a graph in the report that actually shows Canadian pulp mills are really at the bottom of the graph in terms of strength and weakness. A lot of places like Russia, China, even I think like Finland or Sweden is really coming up because they're new, they're fresh, they've got the best technology right now. They've got capacity, so and they can fill kind of those markets externally. So that's something to note. West Fraser, like I said, does about 58% of their business with the U.S., the other 20% with Canada, and then some of the in between with Eastern Asia and some other places. I think Eastern Asia is a place that they could really look at in the future because they've got what seems like such a core group of philosophies, principles, processes that they've been able to scale to multiple mills throughout their entire company, and their supply chain backs that up. And if they could somehow bring that into places out there, that'd be good. Even if they could do joint ventures in places like that and just be supplying the timber, that may be beneficial, especially once the export get laid on them. That could really be something to keep them in a higher profitability margin, because that's how they operate right now. They really lean out that supply chain. That's not to say a lot of times that people hear lean, they might think rigid or unflexible. That's not necessarily the case. They are very capable of weathering certain conditions in the market. They really operate, they're one of the first, and this is kind of fascinating, they're one of the first and one of the leaders in operating more of a pull-based system out of their supply chain. They really do as accurate as they can demand forecasting, and because they've got such good processes in place and those lead times can be compressed, they can defer that final, almost like a decoupling point, but defer that final state of what demand is going to be for production planning as late as possible, so then they're not carrying excess inventory, and they're still able to meet full demand when they have it, and they're not wasting labor and supplies and potential um, waste too, I guess, in creating supply that doesn't have demand matched to it. Very kind of cool and interesting to see something from an outside of the industry where we've been looking at a lot of tech or retailers or stuff. They've become somewhat vertically integrated, own a lot of the transportation means in terms of trucking for themselves. They operate on rail too, so about 20%. So that does well in larger shipments for them. They have a hub out of Dallas, actually a logistics hub that they'll do a lot of cross-docking at to fill a lot of the supply, especially stuff that's coming out of Canada on rail will meet up there and then kind of spread out through there. They could look at doing something if the housing market allows at another place, but right now they're meeting demand quite well out of that singular hub out of Dallas, and they'll also go out of other sawmills direct. So that's not saying that that's the only place that they'll move product out of. But I really think a big thing with them is just how they've been able to instill within their employees the desire for quality, low cost, process improvement, and they're taking that and made a culture out of it where people like to come to work. Sorry there. Sometimes you think that you've thought of everything, but then you haven't. So I apologize for that interruption. But just going back to it, their employees love to come to work for them. They treat their employees well with benefits, and that's a big thing because the workforce in terms of human capital in the supply chain is shrinking in that field. You have a lot less people wanting to go into it. So being able to say that we're a top Canadian employer in terms of what employee satisfaction means and stuff is a big deal, and the same in the southern United States. So continuing to capture and keep that human capital is huge for the supply chain. So that's really all. They align really well with their corporate strategy. They've implemented a very lean supply chain and quite a bit of pull mentality with it. So that's pretty interesting to see because their product life cycle and characteristics can match that, but the demand is a little iffy there. But that's why they've really built some flexibility in where they can. So very interesting. I hope you guys enjoy reading through the report. There's some good graphs on there to look at, might help explain some stuff. I look forward to seeing you guys at graduation.